June 13th, 1943. The morning sun had barely risen above the gray waters of the North Sea when the German radar screens began to flicker with static-laden warnings. In the concrete bunkers of northern France, Luftwaffe operators leaned closer to their glowing scopes. At first, it was just faint echoes, tiny pulses that could be dismissed as weather, seagulls, or calibration errors. But the echoes grew thicker, merging into a single rolling wave. The skies above the channel were alive, and the Germans quickly realized this was no ordinary flight. Engines thundered in unison. The air itself seemed to vibrate. It was a sound unlike anything they had heard before, an industrial storm of hundreds of heavy bombers pushing toward Europe. At airfields from Lille to Rotterdam, sirens wailed. Ground crews shouted orders, scrambling Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs into position. German civilians stopped in the streets and looked upward, hearing the low, endless rumble. The sky seemed to groan under the weight of a fleet so vast it resembled a migrating force of steel birds blotting out the light. For the first time, the soldiers of the Reich understood what American industry truly meant. This was not just an air raid. This was a revelation. In the villages below, farmers pointed at the heavens, muttering prayers as silver wings caught the glint of morning light. The bomber stream was tight, disciplined, precise. Rows upon rows of flying fortresses and liberators moving in formation, as if bound together by invisible chains. German anti-aircraft batteries rotated skyward, crews sweating as they loaded ammunition belts into the flak cannons. Yet there was hesitation in their eyes. The swarm overhead was unlike anything they had faced before. The sheer scale was suffocating. Inside the cockpits of the American bombers, young men barely out of their teens gripped their controls. Sweat dripped beneath their flight goggles as the intercom crackled with clipped, confident orders. They had trained for this moment in the skies of Nebraska, Texas, and England, where formation flying was drilled into muscle memory. Now they flew as one massive organism, a moving fortress wall stretching from horizon to horizon. Each aircraft covered the other with defensive fire, a box of death for any German fighter reckless enough to dive into the storm. The Luftwaffe scrambled, sleek German fighters clawing upward into the pale blue. Pilots with iron crosses pinned to their tunics steadied their nerves as the horizon filled with targets. Yet as they closed in, their radios erupted with chaos. So many, zu viele. They are everywhere. Gunfire tore through the air, tracers streaking like fiery comets. German aces, who once prided themselves on single-handedly ripping apart bomber streams, now found themselves swallowed by defensive firepower. Entire squadrons dove into the swarm only to be shredded by interlocking turrets that spat steel in every direction. On the ground, Wehrmacht soldiers manning observation posts froze in disbelief. Reports flooded through command channels. Bomber streams counted not in dozens, but in hundreds. The Reich's early victories, when German fighters cut through unescorted British bombers with ease, seemed like distant memories now. This was America's industrial might given wings. Each machine carried tons of bombs, each pilot trained with a precision that came from a nation that had converted entire cities into factories of war. Smoke blossomed in the sky as flak shells exploded among the formations, black puffs bursting like malignant flowers. Yet the bombers pressed forward, steady, unwavering as though immune to fear. German gunners cursed, hands blistered from reloading. One soldier, watching from a shattered trench outside Antwerp, whispered to himself, "It never ends. The sky is endless with them." For the first time, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. In Berlin, senior commanders listened grimly to intercepted reports. The Allies had not merely launched a raid, they had unleashed a storm that could not be matched. Intelligence officers tried to calculate the number of planes, but their figures sounded impossible. 200? 300? No, more, far more. It was as if America had decided to pour its entire industrial heart into the clouds above Europe. The German High Command, once confident in its ability to repel invaders, now stared at the map in silence. For the bomber crews, every mile deeper into occupied territory meant a gauntlet of fire. Planes shuddered as flak tore holes through wings. Engines coughed and smoked. Some fell from formation, spiraling into the fields below with fiery tails. Yet the rest pressed on, bound by the unbreakable doctrine of daylight precision bombing. They were not scatter raiders striking under the cover of night. They were the embodiment of America's promise to hit Germany in broad daylight with overwhelming force, so that the Reich would never again feel safe under the sun. German civilians cowered as the formation passed overhead, the shadow of doom stretching across towns and fields. Children covered their ears against the drone, mothers clutching them tighter as the first bombs began to fall. Factories, rail yards, and oil refineries erupted in firestorms. Roofs lifted into the air. Glass shattered for miles. For those below, it seemed as if the very earth trembled beneath America's vengeance. Yet even as flames consumed targets, the true terror for the German soldier lay not in the destruction, but in the revelation. This was only one raid. Tomorrow, another, and another after that. The Reich, which once boasted that it would bring Europe to its knees, now faced an enemy that could summon the skies themselves as a weapon. Each day, more planes rolled off American assembly lines, machines built faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. In the weeks to come, veterans of the Eastern Front would recall the endless tank battles with the Red Army, the grinding sieges, the brutal winters. But when asked what moment revealed that Germany's fate was sealed, many pointed not to Russia, but to that morning when the horizon filled with American bombers. The thunder in the sky told them the truth. Germany was no longer the hunter. It had become the hunted. In that single deafening moment, as formation after formation crossed into Europe, the illusion of German air supremacy shattered. The Reich's soldiers and citizens alike felt the cold hand of inevitability close around them. For all their courage, skill, and machinery, they now faced an adversary that could drown them in steel and fire from the heavens. The moment was not just military. It was psychological. It whispered a message across every trench, every bunker, every command post. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to America. By mid-1943, the Second World War had entered a new and brutal phase. The Reich, once the master of blitzkrieg and surprise, found itself stretched across vast fronts. On the Eastern Front, entire German armies were being swallowed by the Soviet tide at Kursk and beyond. In the Mediterranean, the Afrika Korps had been shattered, and Mussolini's Italy was teetering on collapse. But for the German home front, the most immediate threat came not from Soviet tanks or British commandos, but from the skies above. Germany's leadership had long believed in the impregnability of their air defenses. The Luftwaffe, forged in the crucible of Spain and Poland, was once the most feared air arm in the world. They had cut down the Royal Air Force's bombers in the early years of the conflict, and had imposed their will upon the skies of Europe. But the situation had changed. By 1943, the British had shifted to night bombing, draping their attacks under the cloak of darkness to avoid catastrophic losses. The Germans adjusted their defenses accordingly, perfecting searchlights, radar-guided flak, and night fighter squadrons. Against this, they felt prepared. What they did not anticipate was an enemy that refused to follow the established rules of aerial warfare. The United States Army Air Forces entered the European theater with a doctrine that seemed, at first glance, suicidal: daylight precision bombing. While the RAF struck by night with saturation raids, the Americans intended to hit targets in broad daylight, in formation, and with surgical intent. German officers scoffed at the arrogance. They believed the Luftwaffe's hunters would butcher any bomber foolish enough to fly under the noonday sun. And for a time, the Germans were right, until they were not. American doctrine was born not from bravado, but from conviction. The architects of U.S. air power, men like General Hap Arnold and General Karl Spaatz, believed that Germany's war machine could be dismantled not at the front lines, but at its roots. Bomb the factories, the oil plants, the railway junctions, and the Reich would bleed out, break its industrial spine, and even the most disciplined Wehrmacht divisions would grind to a halt. It was not a war of soldiers and rifles, but of machines and supply lines. The Americans had brought with them the tools to execute this bold plan: the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These were not fragile bombers to be picked apart one by one. They were designed with armor, firepower, and endurance in mind. Each B-17 carried up to 13 50 caliber machine guns, positioned in every direction, transforming the bomber into a fortress in the sky. The B-24, faster and with longer range, extended America's reach deeper into occupied Europe. Together, they were not merely planes, they were weapons of attrition. German intelligence underestimated the scale at which these machines could be produced. The Reich had grown accustomed to war as a contest of elite units, panzer divisions, Stuka squadrons, U-boat wolf packs. But the United States had transformed its civilian industries into war factories on a scale never before imagined. Automobile plants churned out bombers instead of sedans. Shipyards became assembly lines for death from above. In the heart of America, production became a weapon as powerful as any tank or rifle. Where Germany built hundreds, America built thousands. Where Germany replaced losses with difficulty, America drowned them in abundance. By 1943, the 8th Air Force had firmly established itself in England, transforming quiet countryside airfields into bustling cities of steel and fuel. Villages that once echoed with church bells now roared with engines as hundreds of B-17s and B-24s lined up for takeoff. Every morning, local farmers and villagers watched with awe as the sky filled with contrails stretching eastward, a river of silver flowing toward the continent. To the men climbing into those cockpits, it was more than a mission. It was a declaration that the war would now be carried into Germany's very heart. The German High Command understood the threat, but miscalculated its scale. They relied heavily on their fighter arm, confident that their experienced aces could hold the line. Men like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny had carved their names into legend, with dozens of kills each. But for every German ace who rose into the skies, America sent wave after wave of young pilots, trained, disciplined, and armed with machines designed to fight in unison. The Reich's reliance on elite individuals clashed with America's reliance on overwhelming systems. It was a doctrine mismatch, and the consequences would soon be devastating. The first months of the American daylight bombing campaign were costly. German fighters tore into formations, and many crews never returned. Yet with each loss, the Americans adjusted. They tightened formations, perfected their defensive fire, and pushed further inland. Factories in Bremen, shipyards in Kiel, U-boat pens along the Atlantic coast all became targets. And while each mission left wreckage across the French countryside, the bombers kept coming. Unlike the isolated British raids of 1940, these were not sporadic strikes. They were relentless, daily, grinding. German civilians began to notice the shift. No longer did the daylight hours offer safety while the night skies brought terror. Now, both day and night belonged to the bombers. Factories worked under constant threat. Train lines were severed without warning, and the once proud Reich seemed vulnerable from above. Soldiers on leave would look up from cafes in Paris or Brussels and see the contrails stretching eastward, knowing that those bombers were heading to their homeland. The Reich's propaganda machine struggled to contain the panic. They painted the Americans as reckless, as wasteful, as boys playing at war. But behind closed doors, commanders like Hermann Göring were shaken. In private, Göring admitted that if American bombers ever reached Berlin in daylight, he could be called Meyer, a humiliating admission of defeat. Yet, even as he mocked the threat publicly, he knew the truth. America was building a storm that Germany could not stop forever, and beneath it all lay a deeper psychological battle. For German soldiers, the front lines were already hell: frozen steppes in Russia, desert sands in Africa, hedgerows in France. But now, their families, their cities, their very homes were under daily assault. War was no longer a distant front. It had come to their doorsteps, carried by the endless wings of American bombers. As the summer of 1943 bled into autumn, the Luftwaffe still struck hard, but their resources thinned. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and mechanical wear ate at their strength. Meanwhile, American airfields in England grew busier by the week. The balance was shifting, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a steady, unstoppable tide. And for the men of the Wehrmacht, watching the endless formations pour overhead, the question was no longer if Germany could endure, but how long it could survive under skies that no longer belonged to them. At first glance, it seemed impossible. How could these young, untested American crews fly straight into the jaws of the Luftwaffe and return again and again? German aces, many of them hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, tore into formations with disciplined ferocity. Flak burst among the bomber streams like black thunderclouds. Yet still the bombers came, day after day, week after week. The answer to this riddle lay not in courage alone, but in a hidden advantage that Germany had underestimated from the very beginning: the invisible threads of communication and coordination that bound the American war machine together. For the Luftwaffe, aerial combat was still a matter of individual mastery and squadron-level improvisation. German pilots prided themselves on instinct, experience, and skill. Their planes were fast, their cannons deadly, their formations fluid. But communication in the heat of battle remained primitive. Radios often crackled with static, limited in range and clarity. Orders from ground control could be delayed or garbled. Once the melee began, many German pilots fought alone, relying on their eyes and reflexes to survive. It was a system designed for elite warriors, not for sustained attrition against an enemy of overwhelming numbers. The Americans approached war differently. Their bombers did not fly as isolated machines, but as parts of a single, synchronized organism. At the heart of this advantage were the radios, reliable, clear, frequency-modulated sets that cut through static and interference. Every B-17 and B-24 crew could speak, coordinate, and respond instantly. Pilots called out enemy approaches, gunners reported damage, and squadron leaders adjusted formations in real time. What looked to German eyes like impossible discipline was, in truth, the product of invisible lines of communication threading the entire bomber stream together. And beyond the radios lay another secret weapon: doctrine. The Americans trained relentlessly in tight formations, drilling their crews until muscle memory took over. To German observers, these formations seemed suicidal, bunching bombers close together for easier targeting. But the logic was ruthless and brilliant. Each bomber's defensive guns overlapped with its neighbors, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the formation into a fortress. A lone Messerschmitt, diving into such a wall of bullets, could face fire from dozens of .50 caliber machine guns simultaneously. It was not one bomber defending itself. It was the entire formation protecting one another. German pilots quickly realized that attacking from the rear, once the surest way to pick apart a bomber, now became a death sentence. American tail gunners, armed with twin 50s, were backed by waist gunners, top turrets, and belly turrets. Even head-on attacks, pioneered by desperate Luftwaffe units, were costly, as nose gunners and pilots fired into the storm. Reports flooded German headquarters of fighters shredded before they even reached firing range. The shock was palpable. The Reich had prepared for a war of lone duels in the sky. Instead, they faced a war of networks, systems, and coordination. Behind the steel and the radios stood another hidden advantage: logistics. America's ability to maintain these massive aerial fleets was unmatched. Every bomber that took off carried not only its crew, but the weight of an entire industrial network. Spare parts flowed from Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago with mechanical precision. Ground crews in England worked with assembly line efficiency, refueling, repairing, and rearming aircraft at a pace that left German observers stunned. Where the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its dwindling fighters airborne due to fuel and parts shortages, the Americans replaced losses with an almost casual inevitability. There was also a psychological edge hidden within the bombers themselves. To fly in such formations, to hear calm, confident voices over the intercom even as flak ripped through the fuselage, gave American crews a sense of unity. Each man knew he was part of something larger than himself. A waist gunner in the middle of the stream, firing blindly into a diving enemy, felt the strength of dozens of other guns alongside his. Fear remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that no man fought alone. For the Germans, the opposite was true. Once their command aircraft fell, communication disintegrated. Squadrons fragmented. Panic spread. In the confusion, bombers slipped through gaps and pressed toward their targets. Veteran pilots cursed into their radios, furious that they could not rally their men. German reports from 1943 and 1944 are filled with words like chaos, confusion, and unbreakable formations. Again and again, the same question echoed in their after-action notes. How could the Americans maintain such cohesion under fire? And the answer remained maddeningly simple. America's war machine was not built on improvisation or individual heroics. It was built on systems designed to endure losses, absorb shock, and strike again tomorrow. Radios, formations, logistics, and doctrine all converged to create something the Germans had never faced before, an enemy that multiplied its strength rather than divided it. Perhaps the most terrifying realization came when the Germans understood that the bombers were not just weapons, but symbols. Every time a new wave filled the sky, it reminded them that across the Atlantic, a nation of factories and workers stood ready to replace what was lost. Even when dozens of bombers were shot down, hundreds more returned the next day. No amount of individual brilliance could overcome such relentless, organized force. In the early days, some Luftwaffe commanders still clung to optimism. They pointed to the high American losses over targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, believing attrition would eventually break the campaign. But the hidden advantage of America's system was that losses were anticipated, planned for, and absorbed. New crews trained constantly in the United States, ready to replace the fallen. New bombers rolled out of assembly lines every week. German victories in the air felt hollow because the skies filled again with fresh wings. As autumn turned to winter, German soldiers on the ground began to sense it too. When they looked up and saw the endless streams of silver, they no longer saw individual machines. They saw an unstoppable tide, bound together by invisible threads of coordination and communication. It was a revelation more terrifying than any single bomb dropped on their cities, for it told them that this was not merely an air campaign. It was the slow, suffocating tightening of a noose. By the time the Reich fully grasped the nature of this hidden advantage, it was too late. The bombers had become a permanent fixture of the war, their shadows stretching across every German city and battlefield. Radios crackled, formations held, and America's war machine moved forward like a giant with 1,000 iron wings. The heart of America's aerial onslaught was not just courage or strategy, but engineering. To understand why German soldiers felt as though the very sky had turned against them, one must descend into the technical details that made the American bomber fleet unlike anything the world had ever seen. These were not mere planes. They were mechanical ecosystems, each rivet, wire, and bolt designed to function within a doctrine of relentless daylight destruction. Take the B-17 Flying Fortress. First flown in 1935, it was the product of Boeing's vision that a bomber should defend itself as fiercely as a warship at sea. By the time it reached Europe, it had earned its nickname, weighing over 30,000 pounds when fully loaded. The B-17 carried up to 13 Browning 50 caliber M2 machine guns, mounted in every direction: nose, tail, top, belly, and sides. A German pilot approaching from any angle risked flying into a crossfire so thick it was described as like trying to punch through a wall of lead. Its armor plating protected critical areas: the cockpit, the engines, the bomb bay, while its self-sealing fuel tanks absorbed punishment that would turn lesser aircraft into fireballs. Equally fearsome was its ability to endure. Crews told stories of B-17s limping home with engines shot away, tails shredded, wings torn open like paper. One Fortress returned to England with half its vertical stabilizer missing, its fuselage riddled with hundreds of holes, and yet it landed safely. German soldiers on the ground often stared in disbelief at bombers trailing smoke, certain they would crash, only to watch them vanish back toward the channel. Each survivor was a psychological blow, proof that the machines themselves seemed unwilling to die. The B-24 Liberator, though less romanticized, carried its own deadly gifts. With a distinctive high aspect ratio Davis wing, the B-24 could fly faster and farther than the B-17, extending America's reach deep into occupied Europe and beyond. It carried a heavier bomb load, up to 8,000 pounds compared to the Fortress's 4,800, and its production numbers dwarfed even the B-17. By war's end, over 18,000 Liberators had rolled off American assembly lines, the most produced heavy bomber in history. To the Germans, the Liberator was less iconic, but no less devastating. a relentless, mass-produced hammer that struck rail yards, oil fields, and factories with surgical persistence. Both machines were powered by the Wright R1820 and Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, radial beasts that churned out over 1/200 horsepower each. These engines were marvels of reliability, designed to run hot, dirty, and damaged. German fighters carried powerful Daimler-Benz and BMW inline engines, sleek and fast, but delicate. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could seize them. American radial engines, on the other hand, could absorb punishment and keep turning. It was this mechanical toughness that allowed bombers to stagger home when logic said they should have fallen. Inside, each bomber lay a symphony of technology. The Norden bombsight, guarded as a national secret, gave bombardiers the ability, at least in theory, to drop their loads with pinpoint accuracy. While combat conditions often made such precision elusive, the bombsight symbolized America's commitment to daylight targeting. Bombardiers believed they could thread a bomb into a factory roof from 20,000 feet, a faith that carried them through walls of flak. Even when accuracy faltered, the sheer volume of bombs ensured that some would find their mark, devastating Germany's industrial web. But the true hidden marvel was not any single machine, but the system that produced them. In Detroit, the Ford Motor Company transformed Willow Run into a bomber factory unlike any in history. At its peak, Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. Assembly lines stretched a mile long, a river of aluminum and steel rolling from raw materials to finished war machines. In Seattle, Boeing's plants became cities of industry, churning out B-17s with a rhythm that mirrored America's industrial heartbeat. Women, once housewives and secretaries, now riveted fuselages and wired instruments. Their labor as essential to victory as any soldier's rifle. German intelligence officers, reviewing reports of production figures, scoffed at first. They could not fathom a nation building thousands of heavy bombers in a single year. Germany's aviation industry, though skilled, was artisanal by comparison, craftsmanship over mass production. But war is not won by craftsmanship alone. It is won by volume, by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. America had mastered the art of war as industry, and each bomber overhead was proof of that mastery. The bombers were only half the equation. Supporting them were the radios, the lifelines that bound the formations together. The SCR-274 and SCR-522 sets, frequency modulated and crystal controlled, offered clarity and reliability that German FUG sets struggled to match. In the chaos of battle, American crews could coordinate instantly, warning of fighter attacks, adjusting formations, or calling for help. German pilots often cursed their own radios, plagued by interference, limited range, and static. Where the Luftwaffe fought as scattered individuals, the Americans fought as one vast connected organism. Nor should the guns be forgotten. The Browning M250 caliber was a weapon of brutal efficiency. Its armor-piercing rounds tore through thin-skinned fighters, its range outclassing many German weapons. Each bomber carried thousands of rounds, belts of death feeding into every turret. Waist gunners fired until their hands blistered, the air inside the fuselage choked with smoke and the stench of cordite. German reports frequently describe entire squadrons losing cohesion after a single dive into the interlocking fields of fire. To them, the bomber stream was less an air formation than a fortress wall with guns pointing in every direction. Even flak, Germany's great equalizer, was blunted by sheer numbers. The 80mm guns were deadly, their black puffs ripping bombers apart in midair. Yet for every fortress or liberator that fell, dozens pressed on. German gunners cursed as they reloaded, knowing that even their most accurate barrages could not halt the tide. The Americans absorbed losses not with despair, but with determination. Each wreck that fell into a French field was already replaced by a new machine taking off from an English runway. It was this fusion of engineering brilliance and industrial scale that created the nightmare German soldiers described. Skies filled with bombers. The technical details, the radial engines, the Norden bombsight, the Browning guns, the radios, all blended into a single truth. These were machines built not for one mission, not for one raid, but for an endless campaign that ground the Reich's strength away day after day. For the German infantryman, staring upward, the technical marvels were invisible. He did not see the Norden bombsight or the Pratt & Whitney engines. What he saw was a sky blackened with wings, a sound like rolling thunder and a storm of steel descending on his homeland. But behind that spectacle lay the cold precision of American engineering, a force as unstoppable as gravity itself. September 6th, 1943. The skies over Stuttgart were pale and cloudless, a cruel clarity that offered no concealment for the bombers that crossed into southern Germany. From the moment the first silver shapes glimmered over the horizon, German radar screens lit up with frantic pulses. Reports streamed into Luftwaffe command posts, hundreds of aircraft, heading deep into the Reich's industrial heartland. It was not the first raid, but its scale and audacity shook even the most hardened veterans. For the soldiers on the ground, it marked the beginning of a nightmare, an unbroken wave of American steel tearing through their skies. The target was crucial, Stuttgart's sprawling factories where Daimler-Benz engines and armaments kept the Wehrmacht's war machine alive. Destroy them, And German armor, aircraft, and logistics would suffer a blow from which they might never recover. To reach it, however, meant running the gauntlet of one of the most formidable air defense networks in the world. Flak towers, radar-guided batteries, and swarms of interceptors lay in wait. At dawn, the first squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses lifted from English airfields. Engines roared like a rolling earthquake as hundreds of bombers clawed into the sky, forming their tight boxes of death. Villagers in East Anglia, long accustomed to the sight, paused in their fields and cottages, gazing upward as contrails stitched across the heavens. By mid-morning, the streams had merged into one massive organism, a column of wings stretching miles long, bound for Germany. For the Luftwaffe, the alarm was unmistakable. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s scrambled from bases across western Germany. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits, their faces grim. Many were veterans, men with dozens of kills, accustomed to hunting lone stragglers or tearing through thin bomber screens. But as they climbed to altitude, their radios filled with static and overlapping voices. The targets ahead were not a handful of machines. They were hundreds, locked in formation, moving with the relentless certainty of a tidal wave. At 20,000 feet, the German fighters dove. Tracers streaked like meteors as cannon fire ripped through the blue. The bombers did not scatter. They did not flinch. They held their formation, the gunners opening fire in disciplined bursts. Waist gunners shouted bearings into their intercoms. Bandits at 2 o'clock high. As 50 caliber rounds lanced through the sky. German fighters broke apart under the storm. One Messerschmitt exploded in a spray of fire, its fragments tumbling past the bombers it had tried to kill. Another spun downward, trailing smoke, its pilot bailing out too late. The Germans tried new tactics. Some dove head-on, charging through the bomber stream with blistering speed, loosing their cannons in desperate volleys. But even then, they faced nose gunners, top turrets, and cheek-mounted Brownings. Dozens of bombers shuddered under impact, engines aflame, wings torn open, yet the stream closed its gaps and pressed forward. To those watching from the ground, it seemed as if the bombers were invincible, regenerating their formation as quickly as they were broken. As Stuttgart drew nearer, flak batteries joined the chorus. The sky erupted with black blossoms, each detonation shoving shock waves through aluminum frames. Crews gritted their teeth as shrapnel rattled against their fuselages. Oxygen masks hissed, instruments rattled, and still they flew on. A B-17 in the lead group took a direct hit, splitting in two, its pieces cartwheeling into the fields below. Another lost its wing and spiraled into a factory district already choked with smoke. Each loss was a tragedy, yet the survivors continued, bound by their mission. At 11:22 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. The Nordens whirred as bombardiers locked their sights on Stuttgart's sprawling engine works. The city below became a canvas of destruction. Strings of bombs whistled downward, tearing into factories, rail yards, and fuel depots. Explosions rippled through industrial blocks, sending flames and debris skyward. Civilians cowered in shelters as windows shattered and rooftops collapsed. The Reich's war machine shuddered as precision became devastation, but the cost was staggering. As the bombers turned for home, the Luftwaffe struck again, hammering the exhausted crews. Entire squadrons fought tooth and claw to break free. Over 45 American bombers were lost that day, their carcasses littering the French countryside. Hundreds of young men never returned to the airfields of England. Yet, as devastating as the losses were, the damage to Stuttgart was undeniable. Factories lay in ruins, production slowed, and the psychological wound inflicted on Germany was even deeper. German reports afterward were filled with alarm. Commanders noted the unshakable cohesion of the American formations, the iron discipline that made them nearly impossible to break apart. Pilots spoke bitterly of flying into walls of fire, where comrades vanished in bursts of tracer and smoke. Flak crews reported firing thousands of shells, yet the bomber streams pressed on, seemingly endless. One report, captured after the war, noted simply, "They come in the morning, they come at noon, they will come again tomorrow. How do we stop the sky?" For the German soldier in Stuttgart, the battle was more than bombs and flames. It was the realization that his homeland was no longer a sanctuary. Factories that had fueled the Wehrmacht's victories in Poland, France, and Russia now lay vulnerable to American firepower. The air raid sirens no longer heralded brief terror followed by relief. Now they signaled a war without reprieve, a war where the enemy could strike anywhere, at any hour, with hundreds of wings blotting out the sun. The Battle of Stuttgart was only one raid, but it was emblematic of the larger struggle. Each time the bombers came, they left behind not just ruins, but a sense of inevitability. German soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike began to whisper the same thought. If this was only the beginning, what would the end look like? When the surviving bombers limped back to their bases in England, ground crews counted the empty spaces on the tarmac. Losses were mourned, names marked in silence. Yet even as they tallied the cost, new bombers were already rolling off assembly lines in America, new crews already training to take their place. Stuttgart had burned, but the campaign was only intensifying. For Germany, the battle was both a wound and a warning. The skies no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to the United States Army Air Forces, and their storm was only beginning. By the winter of 1943, the raids were no longer isolated storms. They were seasons in themselves, endless, recurring, stretching across the months until German soldiers and civilians alike began to live beneath a permanent shadow. What Stuttgart, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg had revealed was more than just the devastation of bombs. They revealed a truth that gnawed at the morale of an entire nation. Germany was being dismantled not just in battles, but in the very arteries of its war machine. Factories that once ran day and night with unbroken rhythm now sputtered and coughed. Precision machinery lay in twisted heaps. Steelworkers emerged from shelters to find their workshops reduced to charred skeletons. Rail yards, once alive with clattering trains delivering supplies to the Eastern Front, were choked with wreckage and debris. For the German soldier fighting in Russia or Italy, the consequences were immediate. Fewer tanks, fewer trucks, fewer aircraft replacements. What was once a steady flow of reinforcements became a trickle. The front line was no longer just 1,000 miles away. It was above their very heads. Strategically, the American daylight bombing campaign reshaped the battlefield. German doctrine, once built upon the principle of rapid maneuver and overwhelming firepower, began to falter. Tanks sat idle for lack of engines. Planes rusted on runways for want of fuel. Ammunition convoys stalled as locomotives lay buried beneath rubble. The Reich had built a war machine of terrifying speed and efficiency, but it was brittle. And now, under the ceaseless pounding from the skies, its fractures widened with each passing week. But the physical toll was only half the story. The psychological impact was deeper, more corrosive. German civilians, once assured by their leaders that the Reich's air defenses would keep them safe, now lived in constant dread. Children flinched at every distant rumble, uncertain if it was thunder or bombers. Mothers led their families into shelters with a grim regularity, carrying blankets and ration tins as if preparing for a ritual that never ended. The war that had once been portrayed as Germany's triumphant march across Europe now came crashing into their homes in plumes of dust and fire. For the soldiers, the effect was even more profound. Men returning on leave to cities like Hamburg or Cologne no longer found proud, bustling metropolises. They found ruins, cratered streets, and families shattered. Letters from home carried not encouragement, but despair. How could a soldier dig in on the Russian steppe or defend an Italian hillside when he knew his wife and children were cowering under American bombs night after night, day after day? It was a weight that ate at their resolve, a reminder that even if they survived the front, there might be nothing left to return to. On the front lines, German infantrymen saw the bomber streams and felt helpless. Anti-aircraft units fired until their barrels glowed red, but the formations kept coming. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled bravely, but each week fewer planes returned. What was once an air force feared across continents was now exhausted, bleeding pilots faster than they could be replaced. The Americans, by contrast, seemed inexhaustible. For every bomber shot down, 3 more appeared. For every crew lost, another arrived fresh from training. To the men below, it felt like fighting a machine that could never be broken. The psychological shift spread upward through the ranks. Officers who once spoke with confidence of victory began to mutter doubts. Hermann Goering's boast that no enemy bomber would ever reach the heart of Germany became a bitter joke whispered in shelters as Berlin itself trembled under daylight raids. German commanders knew that even their victories in the air were Pyrrhic. Yes, they could destroy dozens of bombers in a single raid, but the factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Willow Run would replace them almost immediately. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin on every front, could not match America's industrial tide. The effect on German strategy was devastating. Resources that might have gone to the Eastern Front or North Africa were now diverted to defend the homeland. Thousands of 88mm guns, some of the finest anti-tank weapons in existence, were chained to cities as flak cannons, unable to aid panzer divisions fighting the Red Army. Fighter squadrons were grounded for lack of fuel, while pilots with hundreds of kills were lost in desperate attempts to stem the bomber streams. The Reich was bleeding itself dry, not in decisive battles, but in the endless grind of defense. And with every raid, the psychological gulf widened between attacker and defender. For the Americans, each mission was dangerous, costly, and terrifying, but it was also purposeful. Crews knew they were striking at the very heart of Germany's ability to fight. They could see the flames rising from factories, the rail lines shattered, the cities burning. They believed in the doctrine of daylight precision, in the promise that their sacrifice was crippling the Reich. That belief carried them back into the sky again and again. For the Germans, the view was reversed. From below, the bombers seemed invulnerable, a storm that could never be stopped. From above, their fighters dove into walls of fire only to be shredded. From the ground, their cities smoldered, their children trembled, and their industry faltered. The sense of inevitability grew heavier with each mission. If this was the scale of American might in 1943, what would it be in 1944 when production reached its peak? It was a question many dared not voice, but all of them felt. The Reich's strength had always been speed, surprise, and shock. In 1939, 1940, and 1941, Germany dictated the tempo of war. Blitzkrieg was a storm that stunned its enemies into collapse. But now the tempo belonged to the Allies. The Americans had built their own storm, slower perhaps, but relentless, unending, and fueled by an economy the Reich could not match. The bomber streams were not just weapons. They were the ticking clock of Germany's demise. And so, by late 1943, the true impact of the campaign was not measured in bombs dropped or factories destroyed. It was measured in morale, of civilians who no longer believed in victory, of soldiers who no longer believed in safety, of commanders who no longer believed in their own boasts. The moment German soldiers realized America's sky was filled with bombers was the moment they understood the war was shifting irreversibly. It was no longer about winning battles. It was about surviving a storm that would never cease until the Reich itself lay in ruins. When the smoke finally cleared in 1945, the cities of Germany no longer resembled the bustling metropolises that had once fueled the Reich's ambitions. Hamburg was a skeleton of brick and ash. Cologne's proud cathedral stood alone amid oceans of rubble. Dresden smoldered under firestorms that scarred it for generations. Berlin, once the capital of a triumphant empire, was reduced to shattered concrete and broken steel. For the German soldier and civilian alike, the memory of how the skies had filled with bombers was not simply a story of destruction. It was the story of inevitability, the crushing weight of industrial war brought from across the ocean. The legacy of America's daylight bombing campaign did not lie solely in the damage it inflicted, though that was immense. German aircraft production, strangled by fuel shortages and wrecked factories, could never again keep pace. Synthetic oil plants, once the lifeline of panzer divisions, were reduced to smoking craters. Rail junctions, smashed again and again, turned logistics into chaos. The Luftwaffe, drained of men and machines, collapsed under the unrelenting tide. Even the Reich's most desperate measures, jet fighters, experimental weapons, underground factories, could not undo the steady attrition. The skies belonged to the Allies, and that domination ensured that when the ground offensives came in Normandy and beyond, they were supported by a storm of steel overhead. But the deeper legacy was doctrinal. The Americans had proven something that even their British allies had doubted, that daylight precision bombing, executed on a massive scale, could break the back of an enemy's war economy. It was not always precise, not always surgical, but it was persistent. And persistence became power. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel would later admit, bitterly, that while Germany had built better tanks and faster fighters, America had built something far more decisive, a system of war that linked industry, technology, and strategy into a single machine. The lesson was not lost on the world that followed. In the Cold War, the idea of striking an enemy's infrastructure from the skies evolved into doctrines of nuclear deterrence and strategic air command. The U.S. Air Force, born from the crucible of the Second World War, built its identity on the promise that American bombers could reach any target anywhere, at any time. B-29s over Korea, B-52s over Vietnam, stealth bombers over Baghdad, all were descendants of the flying fortresses and liberators that once filled Europe's skies. The principle endured. Destroy the enemy's ability to fight at its source, and the battlefield itself becomes secondary. For the veterans who flew those missions, the legacy was personal, etched into memory with the clarity of fear and fire. They remembered the sound of flak rattling like hail against the fuselage, the glow of burning planes spiraling downward, the cries of comrades over the intercom. They remembered the cold, always the cold, at 20,000 feet, oxygen masks frosting as they clutched their controls. And they remembered, too, the sight of their targets below, the factories erupting, the rail lines shattered, the cities engulfed in flames. They had lived through a campaign of staggering cost, but one that had shortened the war and saved countless lives on the ground. For German veterans, the memories were different. They recalled the helplessness of firing until their barrels burned red, only to watch the formations press on. They remembered diving their fighters into the storm, only to see comrades shredded in an instant. They remembered the despair of writing letters home to families who no longer had homes, of returning from the front to cities that no longer existed. For them, the endless bomber streams were not just a weapon. They were a symbol that the Reich, for all its bravado, could not withstand the industrial might of a united America. And for the civilians who lived beneath the shadow of the raids, the legacy was one of endurance. Mothers who shielded their children in cellars, fire brigades who clawed through rubble for survivors, workers who returned to shattered factories only to face the bombers again the next day. They carried scars, physical, emotional, generational, that outlived the war itself. For them, the sound of engines in the sky would forever carry echoes of fear. Yet from the ruins of Germany also rose a different legacy. The shattered cities became symbols not only of destruction, but of rebirth. In the post-war years, with American aid and European resilience, places like Stuttgart, Hamburg, and Berlin rebuilt themselves into thriving centers of democracy and industry. The skies that had once been filled with bombers became filled with commerce, travel, and connection. The very airfields from which destruction had once poured became hubs of cooperation under NATO, linking former enemies into allies. The strategic impact of America's bomber fleets went far beyond the Second World War. They changed how nations thought about power itself. No longer was victory determined solely by armies clashing on fields of battle. It was determined by who could mobilize their industry, who could master the skies, who could connect their soldiers and machines into a single, unbreakable network. The Americans had shown that connection outweighed firepower, that endurance outweighed brilliance, and that speed of production defeated even the most formidable armor. In the end, the moment German soldiers realized America's sky was filled with bombers was more than just a moment of shock. It was the turning point in a war of systems, the instant when men on the ground understood that they were facing not just aircraft, but an entire nation's might given wings. It was the sound of inevitability, the roar of engines that foretold the collapse of an empire. Decades later, military historians would still argue over the precise effectiveness of the bombing campaign. Did it shorten the war by months or years? Did it break Germany's economy, or merely hasten an already crumbling edifice? But for the men who were there, such questions mattered little. They remembered the sight itself. Skies so thick with bombers that the sun seemed dimmed, the sound so constant it became a second heartbeat of the war. And as one German officer later confessed with a candor stripped of propaganda and pride, "We built tanks and planes. You built factories. And in the end, your factories defeated us." The lesson endures. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower. Systems outweigh individuals. And when the skies are filled with wings, no fortress, no army, no empire can stand against the storm.